That was a quote that you're probably familiar with, but that was attributed from Joseph Stalin's secretary, Boris Bazarov, where he was talking about the power lies in the people who count the votes. And that is really important as we talk about part 2 of our series of what will happen on January 6th when the joint session of Congress in DC meets to certify the election. If you haven't seen part 1, click above and you can check that out. If you have seen it, then we're ready to kick it in, because in this video, we're going to talk about who really has the power to count the votes when we're talking about this joint session of Congress. It's really interesting. We're going to give you 2 aspects of this from a constitutional perspective and also an historical perspective. Both very sound arguments, and they all point to the exact same person. And I'm pretty sure you can guess who that person already is. And we're going to start right now. Hello, my name is Kyle, and this is The Conservative Take, where we take culture, TV, movie, news, and politics and filter it to you the right way. If this is your first time here, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button and that bell icon so you don't miss any future content. And also, if you want to join us and support us when we're trying to do, then please click that join button to find out how to do just that. In this video, I'm going to be referencing an article by Alexander McCree. Here's the link behind me right now. And this is talking about the power of where all of the votes come from. And the question truly becomes, who has the power to count the votes? As that quote attributed to Stalin says, it's not the people who actually cast the votes that have the power. It's the people that actually count the votes, and how they count the votes is what really matters. So as we mentioned in our last video, you don't go to the voting booth to vote for a president. You go to the voting booth to vote for a set of electors who are then going to vote for the president based on the popular votes of your state. Got it? Well, a Loyola University Chicago law professor, Edward B. Foley, wrote in his memoir, Preparing for a Disputed Election in 2018, he talks about the interpretation of the 12th Amendment and what that means. Who, constitutionally speaking, has the authority to count the votes? As we know, the U.S. Constitution governs all the things dealing with our elections, and the 12th Amendment is where it really plays out. It says here,
"The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted."
He says,
the peculiar passive voice phrasing of this crucial sentence opens up the possibility of interpreting it to provide that the President of the Senate has the exclusive constitutional authority to determine which certificates to open and thus which electoral votes to be counted.
So what he's saying is that the passive nature of the sentence of the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all the certificates and the votes shall then be counted, is saying that the Vice President has the exclusive authority. He goes on to say this.
This interpretation can derive support from the observation that the President of the Senate is the only officer, or instrumentality, of government given an active role in the process of opening the certificates and counting the electoral votes from the states. The Senate and House of Representatives, on this view, have an observational role only. The opening and counting are conducted in their presence for the sake of transparency, but these two legislative bodies do not actually take any actions of their own in this opening and counting process. How could they? Under the Constitution, the Senate and the House of Representatives only act separately, as entirely distinct legislative chambers. They have no constitutional way to act together as one amalgamated corpus. Thus, they can only watch as the President of the Senate opens the certificates of electoral votes from the states and announces the count of the electoral votes contained therein.
So here Foley is saying, look, this is just transparency for the House of Representatives and the Senate to watch the President of the Senate, the Vice President, open and count the votes so that there's transparency, and that there's no way that the House and the Senate can come together on anything for the simple fact that they're two separate chambers. And so that was the interpretation that he was talking about here. But see, Foley isn't the only person to have this opinion. A gentleman by the name of John Harrison, in his book called Nobody for President, says even more forcefully this.
The 12th Amendment provides that in the presence of the two houses, the President of the Senate shall open all the certificates from the electors. But as history shows, there can be more than one purported certificate from a state. Indeed, multiple purported certificates may be the most common cause of dispute. The certificates that the President of the Senate is to open, however, are those of the electors, not those of non-electors. Hence, in order to know which certificates to open, the President of the Senate must know which of competing slates of electors were validly appointed.
So what Harrison is saying here is that the President of the Senate, as he's counting these votes, must know that these are valid votes because these are votes of electors, not of non-electors. So if you have anything that's competing, dueling electors like we have here, in this case, then you have to know who is good and who is bad. In other words, which ones are valid. It goes on to say this.
Natural reading of the 12th Amendment thus indicates that in one especially important context, the dispute is to be resolved by a single individual. Neither House nor Senate is given any authority over the President of the Senate when it comes to opening the certificates, and Congress by statute may not control the exercise of this constitutionally granted authority any more than it may tell the President who to pardon.
So constitutional law is not the end-all be-all. The framers of the Constitution, in the making of this republic, intended for there to be decisions made on the Constitution, and past decisions should all come to bear. So the question becomes, what is the historical argument for the President of the Senate to be the sole authority in opening the Electoral College votes or the certificates? So to answer that question, Foley says this.
Whatever each of us personally thinks of this interpretative argument, it is necessary to acknowledge that it has a significant historical pedigree. It routinely had its advocates in the years leading up to the disputed election of 1876. During that intense dispute, it was conveniently invoked by Republicans, since the President of the Senate was one of their own at the time. After the resolution of that ugly dispute, the argument was resurrected by some during the congressional debates that led to passage of the Electoral Count Act of 1887.
So what is the Electoral Count Act of 1887? Well, it was some legislation that came out of the Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden election of 1876, a highly contentious election, which I will do a video on at some point in the future because it's so interesting. But out of that, there were some measures put in place of how the counting of this can work, how the Electoral College should work and play. And so this is also going to be a topic for tomorrow's video as well. But just for now, just know that that's what the context of it was. So if we go back to the congressional record of 1887 and the Electoral College Act, we'll find some quotes from people, many people, who also hold the opinion that the President of the Senate is the only one who opens and counts the votes, even though many of them were not happy about it.
The counting function is vested in the President of the Senate, and the necessary and proper clause does not confer on Congress the power to assume unto itself the duty which the Constitution imposes on that officer. Senator James Falconer Wilson, Iowa.
If the Constitution does, by fair implication, vest in the President of the Senate the power and duty not only to open, but also to count the votes, then Congress cannot, by this or any other legislation, take away or transfer to any other person or officer that power and duty. Representative Jehu Baker, Illinois.
The Constitution says that the votes shall then be counted, and if this mandate be addressed to the President of the Senate, that ends the question so far as the counting is concerned. The Constitution has then entrusted him with the whole power, and any legislation to direct him would be an impertinent intrusion upon his prerogative. Emory Spear, Georgia.
The President of the Senate's discretion in opening certificates shows the necessity of an amendment of the Constitution. Senator Levi Parsons Morton, New York.
But these people in these quotes, the ones who actually did the act, weren't the only ones who were upset by it. Foley goes on to explain this.
Thus, Republicans can point to the historical pedigree of this position, observing that Republicans made the same argument during the disputed election of 1876, and that at least some recent law journal scholarship has supported this position. Unembarrassed by the apparent conflict of interest caused by Mike Pence simultaneously being a candidate for re-election and arbiter of the electoral dispute, these Republicans observe that Thomas Jefferson was in essentially the same position during the disputed election of 1800. And yet the 12th Amendment left this provision in place when Congress rewrote the procedures for the Electoral College afterwards.
So now it's where it gets interesting. If you caught that, you saw that Thomas Jefferson, who was the vice president in 1800, was responsible for counting the votes as well. But in this case, he was also running for president, and he was going up against Aaron Burr, John Adams, John Jay, Charles Pinckney for the presidency of the United States. And he had to make the determining factor of a certain state, which had some voting irregularities, and just so happens to be Georgia. And so to make a long story short, Georgia had 4 electoral college votes that were in dispute. If you go back to the archives and look at that, you will see that there are irregularities, as fully mentioned right here. So if you catch that, Thomas Jefferson didn't stop. He counted the votes and accepted the ones that were invalid, in this case, Georgia. And the framer of the Constitution, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, the guy who's on Mount Rushmore, only became president because he used his unilateral power as president of the Senate to open and count the presidential ballots in his own favor. But this isn't the only time that this has been in dispute and been done by the president of the Senate. Basan Kazvian, in his book, Is the Electoral College Act Unconstitutional? He points out that in the election of 1856, Wisconsin had votes that were out there, but they couldn't be cast because of a snowstorm. Despite that, the president of the Senate took those votes and counted them anyway. So in the end, the ballots were open and counted, and just shows from a historical standpoint that the president of the Senate's choice is more powerful than the collective will of Congress. And so I'll leave that detail below in the link below. Check it out for yourself, and you'll see that there's other cases where this has happened, and there's plenty of historical evidence to back up this, as well as the constitutional evidence that the president of the Senate is the sole authority to open and count ballots. McCree ends his argument with this statement. I'm going to read it for you right here. Come January 2021, Vice President Mike Pence will be presented with the sealed certificates containing the ballots of the presidential electors. At that moment, the presidency will be in his hands. And there's nothing stopping Pence, under the authority vested in him as the president of the Senate, from declining to open and count the certificates from the 6 disputed states. If they are, as more than 70% of Republicans believe, certificates from non-electors appointed via fraud, why should he open and count them? As Harrison noted, the certificates that the president of the Senate is to open are those of electors, not those of non-electors. The president's position going into January 2021 is thus considerably stronger than the mainstream media would like to admit. There is a constitutional language and historical precedent that gives his vice president the unilateral power to decide the outcome of our contested election. So Alexander McCree lays out a very compelling argument here to answer the question, who can count the votes, from a constitutional standpoint and also from a historical standpoint. He goes into the wording of it from constitutional lawyers, also from the actual people who wrote the bill or the act, the Electoral College Act, that said that this all points back to the president of the Senate, even though many of them didn't like that. So that's there, and Mike Pence has that authority. But what happens if he doesn't do the right thing? We'll talk about this in part 3, that there's actually a possibility that what he does in terms of counting illegal votes could be breaking the law himself. And so that's going to be a different story altogether. Look for that for part 3. So the big question is this: what do you guys think about this? What do you think about this? What do you think Mike Pence will do? It lays it out there quite neatly. Now, I know there was a lawsuit that came out recently, and he's telling them to push that aside, probably because that lawsuit doesn't need to be made. If you know what I'm talking about, I'll leave a link about that as well in the comments. And so if you like what we do on this channel, we take culture, TV, movie, news, and politics and filter it to you the right way, then please hit that like and subscribe button and that bell icon so you don't miss any future content. If you want to help join this channel, support us, then please click that join button to find out how to do that. Feel free to check out our Discord server. As always, please check out some content that we have right here.